The mountain fog in Marlow County settles into the hollows the way memory settles into an old man's chest. It comes down slow in the last hour before dawn silver against the black of the pines, and it hangs there long enough that a person standing in it forgets whether the light is coming or going. In the second week of April, in the year 2007, on a Wednesday morning that smelled of wet cedar and diesel smoke, and the raw earth that shows up after a winter thaw, that fog was the last thing Silas Ashby ever saw. I was 84 years old. He had lived on the same 48 acres in the foothills of western North Carolina since he was 3. He had buried a wife, buried a son, buried a daughter-in-law, buried a grandson lost to something in Kuwait in '91 that the Army never fully explained. What he had left was a granddaughter in Charlotte and a farm that had been shrinking around him every year since the pasture stopped holding. He was standing at his kitchen window at 5 in the morning, watching the fog come down over the eastern ridge, one hand on the sill and the other on a cup of black coffee, when the artery in his brain that had been thinning for a decade quietly gave up. He was found by the mail carrier at 2 in the afternoon, still standing, one shoulder braced against the frame of the window, the coffee gone cold in his hand. The mail carrier called the county. The county called Charlotte. And Charlotte, in the person of a 22-year-old cashier at a hardware store on Independence Boulevard, put down a length of copper pipe she had been ringing up for a plumber and asked her supervisor if she could leave. Her name was Marin Ashby. She was 5'4". She was slim, the way farm-working women are slim, which is to say, lean without being fragile. She had light skin the color of buttermilk, with a warm undertone from the summers she had spent on her grandfather's land, and a scatter of small, pale freckles across the bridge of her nose she had never been able to bleach out. Her hair was medium brown with warm chestnut and sun-lightened undertones parted near the center and pulled back into a loose, low ponytail, several thin strands falling free around her forehead and cheeks. She had large, light blue-gray eyes that watched a room longer than most people were comfortable with. She wore a red and cream plaid flannel shirt that had once been her grandfather's, a caramel canvas farm jacket that had also once been his, and faded medium blue jeans dusty around the thighs and knees from a broken bag of masonry sand she had lifted in aisle 6 the day before. She did not cry when her supervisor told her. She said, "I'll come in Saturday for my last shift." She untied the green apron. She hung it on the hook by the time clock. She got in a 1996 Ford Ranger, the color of a mourning dove, drove west on I-40 for 3.5 hours, and did not stop for gas until she was past Asheville. She did not cry at the funeral either. There is a certain kind of crying a country woman does not do in front of neighbors, and Marin Ashby had been raised to know exactly which kind that was. She stood at the graveside in a black wool coat that had belonged to her mother and did not weep. She shook the hands of 41 people she mostly did not know. She listened while a preacher from a small stone church down in the valley told a story about Silas building a bridge across Little Sipsey Creek in 1968 using cedar posts he had cut and dragged out of the North Hollow by himself. And she held on to that image inside her chest, the way a person holds on to a warm stone in a cold pocket. Afterwards, she drove up the gravel road to the farm. The farm was 48 acres of tired ground in the foothills west of a town called Marlow that most maps did not bother to name. It sat in a bowl between two ridges. The eastern ridge was steep and wooded and belonged mostly to the state. The western ridge was gentler and belonged to a cattleman named Boyd Threlkeld, whose herd had once numbered 100 and now numbered 43. The bowl in between was pasture or had been. Cows had grazed it hard in the 60s and 70s. A row of tobacco had failed in it in the 80s. A little corn had been tried and given up in the 90s. By 2007, when Silas died standing at his kitchen window, the ground in that bowl was thin as coffee that had been strained through cheesecloth. It was the color of nothing. It grew a low, ragged crabgrass that broke off in your hand if you tugged it. The topsoil, where you could still find any, was maybe 1.5 inches deep. Below that was the hard, yellow-red clay that western North Carolina wears under its skin like an old bruise. The barn leaned 5 degrees to the north. The house was a two-story white clapboard that had not been painted since Reagan was president. The kitchen window Silas had died at was still open. Someone from the county had put a piece of cardboard over the pane where the mail carrier had broken it to get in. Maren stood in the yard for a long time. She stood there until the fog burned off the western ridge and until she could hear in the distance the whine of a saw. Someone was cutting hardwood somewhere down the valley. She had grown up hearing that sound. It was the sound of the small family sawmill that Silas had bought firewood from every October for the last 30 years. She thought about her grandfather standing at the window with the coffee going cold in his hand. She thought about the phone call from Charlotte 3 days ago, and the drive west, and the way her mother had refused to come to the funeral because she and Silas had not spoken since Christmas of '99. She did not cry. She went inside. The house smelled of him. That was the first thing. It smelled of pipe tobacco he had quit smoking in 1988 and coffee grounds, and the faint sourness of old newsprint, and the particular sweetness of the cedar chest in the front room. She walked through it slow. She did not touch anything at first. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the window and at the cardboard patch and at the cup that someone from the county had washed and set upside down on the drain board. She walked through the front room. She walked past her grandmother's rocking chair. She climbed the narrow staircase to the upstairs bedroom she had slept in every summer of her childhood, and the bed was made the way it had been made in 1994. The same blue and white quilt her grandmother had pieced in the fall of '81, and Maren sat on the edge of it, and she still did not cry. She sat there until the light in the room turned amber. Then she went back downstairs. She went into the small back office where Silas had kept his ledgers. There was a roll-top desk that had belonged to his father. There was a metal filing cabinet the color of an old refrigerator. There was a framed photograph on the wall of Silas at maybe 60 years old, standing beside a small hand-lettered sign in front of a steaming pile of what looked like garden mulch, and next to him, half in the shadow of a barn door, a woman in a canvas coat with her hair in a long braid, looking at the pile and not at the camera. Maren looked at the photograph a moment. She did not know the woman. She turned to the desk. In the top drawer, under an unpaid electric bill and a magnifying glass with a bent handle, she found a small notebook with a brown cardboard cover, softened by decades of pocket, carry the spine held together with a strip of black electrical tape. She opened it. The dates went back to 1979. Rainfall records, calving dates, prices for hay per bale in September of '83, a press leaf between two pages brittle and colorless that had once been maple, a pencil sketch of a small conical pile of what she took to be wood chips. Beside the sketch her grandfather had written in the careful blocky hand she remembered from birthday cards, one line she read 3 times. "The pile ain't waste. It's a forest that ain't finished yet." The date under that line was July 11, 1983. She turned the page. The next entry was dated 3 months later. It said only, "Elmer laughed. Boyd's daddy laughed." Stopped. Then in an ink slightly different added later, "Try again someday. Maybe M will, M." Maren sat down in the chair at the roll-top desk. She put her elbow on the desk and her forehead in her hand, and she stayed that way for a long minute. Then she lifted her head and read the rest of the notebook straight through, and by the time she finished, it was full dark outside, and she had not turned on a lamp, and the only light in the room came from a security bulb her grandfather had wired to the corner of the barn in 1992. And by that thin blue light, Maren Ashby understood for the first time in her life that her grandfather had not been a failed farmer. He had been an interrupted one. She did not sleep that night. She sat in the kitchen with a notebook and a legal pad and a pencil, and at 4 in the morning made a decision. She was not going back to Charlotte. She was not going back to the hardware store on Independence Boulevard. She was not going to sell the 48 acres to a man named Devlin Rourke, whose card had been left in the door frame on the day of the funeral by a woman in a black pantsuit who had said, "When you're ready to talk, sweetheart," and whom Maren had wanted to hit. She was going to stay. She did not know yet what she was going to do. But she was going to stay because the notebook her grandfather had left in the top drawer of his father's roll-top desk had in that neat, blocky hand written the initial M, as if he had known for a long time that she would come. That was on a Wednesday. On Friday morning at 7:15, a pickup truck with a chipper trailer behind it turned off the state road and climbed the gravel drive to the farm. The truck was a white Chevrolet Silverado with a family sawmill logo on the door, a hand-drawn cross pair of logs above the words Beckett Sawmill Marlow, NC Est, 1958. The man driving it was 60 years old. He had a face like a walnut. He wore a green ball cap so old the mesh at the back had faded to almost white. His name was Harlan Beckett. His father had sold Silas Ashby 10 cords of firewood every October since Eisenhower, and Harlan had done the same since the day his father passed the sawmill down to him in 1991. He got out of the truck slow. He turned the ball cap in his hands. "Miss Ashby, Mr. Beckett, I'm awful sorry about your granddaddy. Thank you." He looked at the pasture. He looked at the barn. He looked at his boots. He looked at the pasture again. He was working up to something the way a man his age works up to something, which is to say without hurry. He said, "I know this ain't the time. I know it ain't. But I got a situation, and there ain't nobody else in the valley I can ask. And if I don't ask you now, I gotta load them chips onto a semi and pay to haul them to a landfill down in Rutherford County, and the landfill just raised the rate again, and I—" He stopped. He tried again. "I got about 800 cubic yards of fresh hardwood chips setting in my mill yard. Oak, maple, hickory, cherry. Clean stuff. No paint, no pallet wood, no chemical. I've been cutting a big order for a fella up in Boone, and it's more waste than I can move. Your pasture down there is empty. It ain't seen a cow since '94. If you'd let me back a truck up here on Fridays and drop a load at the low end where the ground's flattest, just till I figure something out, I'd be obliged. I'd pay you what I'm paying the landfill, $50 a load. I know it's an eyesore. I'll figure something else out soon as I can." Marin looked past him at the low pasture. She looked at the pale, bare ground down there, the way the sun was coming across it, the way the fog was lifting off the far corner where the old lane bent toward the creek. She looked at Harlan Beckett's hands turning the ball cap. She said, "You don't have to pay me." He looked up. She said, "Bring more." There was a full 3 seconds where Harlan Beckett stood in the drive with his mouth slightly open. He was not a stupid man. He was a careful man. He had been running a small family sawmill in a hard county for 32 years, and he had learned to read the phrases people use with him for the second and third and sometimes fourth meaning underneath the first one. But he had not been expecting "bring more." He said, "Ma'am, bring more," she said, "if you've got it to spare." "You want more of it?" "Yes. On your pasture. On my pasture. Every Friday. Every Friday. Or more if you have it." He turned the ball cap another quarter turn. He looked at the pasture. He looked back at her. "Miss Ashby," he said, "I'm not going to pretend I understand. But if you're sure, I'll bring you every chip that comes off my saws until you tell me stop." "I'm sure." "You want me to pay you, though. I ought to pay you." "No, Miss Ashby. No, Mr. Beckett. I don't want to be paid to take it. I want it. There's a difference." He looked at her another long moment. Then he put the ball cap back on his head and touched the brim. "Yes, ma'am. I'll be back Friday and every Friday after." I got in the truck. He backed down the drive careful because the drive was a switchback and there was a drop-off on the right side that had swallowed a hay wagon in the fall of '89. He drove back to Beckett's sawmill in the low April sun, and when he pulled up to the mill and his son-in-law asked him how it had gone at the Ashby place, Harlan Beckett stood at the open door of the pickup with his hand on the roof and said, "I don't know what I just witnessed, boy, but I think we just found a home for our chips." He came back on Friday. He came back on the Friday after that. By the end of April, there was one steaming mound of hardwood chips at the low end of the Ashby pasture. By the middle of May, there were 3. By the 1st of June, there were 5, and the tallest of them was taller than the roof of Marin's Ford Ranger, and the whole low end of the pasture smelled like a forest floor after rain, and steam came off the piles at dawn like breath coming off a horse in November. The children on the school bus named it that summer. They named it the way children name what they can see from a window without asking permission from anyone, and by the middle of June, the phrase was known in every farm along Marlow Ridge Road. Woodchip Mountain, the Ashby girl. The Woodchip Mountain up at the Ashby place. Somebody's grandma at Sunday dinner said her son had driven past it on his way to Boone and had counted 7 piles now, 7 of them, and had she lost her mind up there? And the answer, according to Sunday Dinner in Marlow County in the summer of 2007, was that yes, Silas Ashby's granddaughter had lost her mind up there, or she was going to. Boyd Threlkeld leaned on his fence on a warm evening in the last week of June and called across the property line, "Marin, honey, you building the county's biggest mulch pile, or you lost your mind." Marin was standing on the north face of Pile 3 with a small brass thermometer on a wooden stake, driving the stake into the pile up to the 12-inch mark. She turned her head. She did not answer right away. That was her way. She listened longer than most people were comfortable with. She pulled the thermometer out. She read it. She wrote a number in a small blue notebook she had bought at the drugstore in Marlow the week before. She looked at Boyd Threlkeld across the wire. She said, 131 degrees, Mr. Threlkeld. Ma'am, the temperature in the middle of the pile, it's 131 degrees Fahrenheit, at 12 inches down. Boyd Threlkeld stared at her. I was 55 years old. He was a cattleman. His father had been a cattleman. His father's father had cleared the Western Ridge with 2 mules and a chain in 1908. Boyd Threlkeld had a 4th-grade understanding of what compost was, which is to say he knew it was a thing you did with chicken droppings and old lettuce leaves in a plastic bin behind the house, and he had never in his life put a thermometer into anything that was not either a cow or a Thanksgiving turkey. He said, "That's warmer than a cup of coffee." "Yes, sir." "That pile's cooking itself." "Yes, sir." "You know why?" Marin looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I have an idea, but I'd rather not say till I'm sure." Boyd Threlkeld took his cap off. He scratched the back of his head with the same hand that was holding the cap. He put the cap back on. He said, "Girl, your granddaddy tried something like this in '83. He got laughed clean out of the co-op. He never brought it up again." "I know he tried it." "Then you know." "I know he tried it, Mr. Threlkeld. I don't know he was wrong." Boyd Threlkeld looked at her a long time. Then he shook his head, not in anger, but in the way a man shakes his head when he cannot decide whether to laugh or worry. He said, "You've got your granddaddy's stubborn in you." "Yes, sir, I do." "You're going to need it." "Yes, sir." He turned and walked back to his house. Marin wrote his 3 sentences in the small blue notebook, dated them, and underlined the last one. She was going to need it. The letter from the bank came the next morning. She saw the return address before she opened the envelope. Blue Ridge Community Bank and Trust, Marlow Branch. Odette Ruthven, branch manager. She stood at the kitchen counter with the envelope in her hand and the coffee going cold behind her the way it had gone cold in her grandfather's hand in April. And she thought about what a letter from a bank on a Tuesday in June meant when addressed to the sole heir of a man who had been dead less than 3 months. She opened it. She read it twice. Then she sat down at the kitchen table and read it a 3rd time. The note was for $32,400. It had been taken out by Silas Ashby in September of 2004, secured against the deed of the 48 acres at an interest rate of 7.75%. It had been used, according to the loan file, to replace the roof of the barn, to bore a new well, and to rebuild the septic system. It was a 5-year note with a balloon payment. The balloon payment was due on September 15th of 2009. It was a lump sum of the entire remaining balance. If the balloon was not met by that date, the bank had the right to foreclose on the deed of record. 2 years and 3 months. That was what she had. The letter was signed by Odette Ruthven, branch manager, in a rounded, careful hand. Under the signature, Odette Ruthven had added by pen a single line, "I knew your granddaddy. I am truly sorry. Please come see me. There is nothing I can do about the terms, but there are options we can walk through together." Marin folded the letter along its original creases. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope in a drawer of the kitchen table where her grandmother had once kept twist ties and rubber bands. She stood up. She walked out into the yard. The mid-morning sun was hitting pile 3 at an angle that caught the steam still rising from its north face. The steam went up in thin ropes and then dispersed against the blue. Behind pile 3, the eastern ridge was green with hardwood, and beyond that invisible from here, the town of Marlow sat in its own bowl with its little bank on Main Street, where Odette Ruthven was probably at her desk right now. And beyond that, in a glass front office building in Charlotte, a man named Devlin Rourke was probably sitting with his feet up on a walnut desk, waiting for a woman he had never met to give up. Marin stood in the yard and thought about all of it. She thought about the notebook. She thought about the initial M. She thought about her grandfather at 60 years old in the photograph in the office, standing next to a small conical pile of chips and a woman in a canvas coat with a long braid. She thought they laughed him out of the co-op in '83, and she thought they are not going to laugh me out of anything. Devlin Rourke came up the drive on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of July. He was driving a silver Lexus SUV that had been washed that morning at a car wash in Asheville. He was wearing a khaki jacket with too many pockets the way men from Charlotte dress when they are going into what they think of as the country. He was 38 years old. He had a small, tight smile that did not reach his eyes, and he had the manners of a person who has been trained by a firm to have manners. He got out of the SUV. He looked at the piles. He looked at Marin, who was coming down out of the barn with a shovel and a burlap sack. He said, "Miss Ashby, Devlin Rourke. I left my card at the funeral. I don't know if it reached you." "It reached me. May I have a moment? You've got the time it takes me to walk to the low pile." She kept walking. He fell in beside her. He was 2 inches taller than she was in his loafers and half a head shorter than the piles when they got there. He had the good sense not to ask what the piles were. He looked at them like a man looks at a mountain range in a country he does not intend to visit. He said, "Miss Ashby, my firm represents Terra Stark Development. We have been assembling parcels in Marlow County for approximately 3 years. We are interested in yours. I'm authorized to open at $180,000 for the 48 acres cash at closing 60-day close. That would be net to you after clearing the note at Blue Ridge Community. I understand the note is a hair over 32. You would walk with $148,000 in your pocket, free and clear at 22 years old. That is a good outcome, Miss Ashby. That is a great outcome." Marin drove the shovel into the base of pile 6. She lifted a shovel full of chips. She let them fall through her fingers. They were warm. She said, "What are you going to do with it?" "Ma'am, with the 48 acres. Devlin Rourke's small, tight smile did not move. He said, "We're looking at a small hospitality development. Cabins for the Asheville tourist market. Nothing intrusive. Cabins. Yes, ma'am. On the low pasture. On the higher ground, actually. The pasture we'd probably let go back to hardwood. Restore the natural. You'd let go the low pasture. That's a probable configuration, yes. Where the creek runs." Devlin Rourke's small, tight smile flickered. It was only a flicker. It was a movement no wider than the wing beat of a moth. But Marin Ashby had been raised by a man who watched every face in a room longer than the room was comfortable with, and she had inherited that from him, whether she wanted it or not, and she saw the flicker. She said, "Little Sipsey Creek runs through the low pasture, Mr. Rourke, comes off the eastern ridge, runs south through my 48, and then through Mr. Threlkeld's place, and then through 5 little farms further down and empties into the broad river just above the old Marlow mill. That's a lovely feature." "It's a lovely feature." "Yes, ma'am." She looked at him a long moment. She said, "Mr. Rourke, what are you going to do with the creek?" He said, "Nothing that would affect its flow, Miss Ashby. I can assure you of that." She said, That's not what I asked." He looked at her. He said, "Quiet, ma'am. I'm authorized to move to 195. That is a very good number. That is above appraisal. That is well above appraisal for this county and this market. If you take it, you clear your note, you help your mother, you set yourself up. If you don't, I want to be candid with you, ma'am, because I respect you. The note comes due in September of '09. If it doesn't get paid, the bank sells the deed at auction. The parcel goes for less than what I'm offering you now. And when it does, my firm will be the buyer at auction. So you can take 195 today, or you can watch it go for 120 at the courthouse steps. Either way, the parcel ends up with us. The only variable is what's in your pocket. Marin looked at him. She did not answer. She reached into the pocket of her caramel jacket. She took out the small blue notebook. She opened it to a fresh page. She wrote the date. She wrote his name. She wrote the number 195. She wrote the phrase cabins in quotation marks. She wrote the phrase the low pasture we'd probably let go in quotation marks. She wrote the words Little Sipsey Creek and drew a small, careful arrow from those words to the number. She closed the notebook. She put it back in the pocket. She said, Mr. Rourke, you've had your moment. Miss Ashby, I have work to do. She turned. She walked back up toward the barn with the shovel over her shoulder. Devlin Rourke stood at the base of pile 6 in his loafers, in the middle of a pasture that used to be a pasture. And after a long moment, he took a folded piece of paper out of his jacket pocket and set it on top of a fence post, and he weighted it with a small round stone from the drive, and he got back into the silver Lexus SUV and drove down the switchback more carefully than Harlan Beckett had. When he was gone, Marin walked down to the fence post and picked up the folded paper. She did not open it. She walked it back to the house. She opened the drawer where the letter from the bank was. She put the folded paper in the drawer beside the letter. She closed the drawer. She sat down at the kitchen table. She wrote in the notebook in the space under Devlin Rourke's name 2 more lines. Tara Stark did not come here for cabins. They came here for the creek, and under that ask why. She met Dr. Verity Kestrel at the Marlow Farmers Market on a Saturday morning in the last week of July. The market was small. It sat in a gravel lot behind the county extension office. There were maybe 14 stalls. Marin was there because she had begun in a small way to sell a few dozen eggs from a flock of barred rock hens her grandfather had kept, in which she had inherited along with the notebook and the barn and the note at the bank. She sold the eggs for $2 a dozen out of a plastic milk crate on the tailgate of her Ford Ranger. She did not have a sign. She did not need one. In Marlow County in 2007, if you had eggs and you were parked at the market, people found you. Dr. Verity Kestrel was 72 years old. She was a small, spare woman with iron gray hair, cut so short it barely showed under her wool cap. She had a face like a hawk. She had spent 40 years as a soil microbiologist at the State University's Agricultural Extension Station up in Waynesville, and she had retired 8 years ago to a small hillside homestead 6 miles east of the Ashby farm, where she kept goats and gave 1 lecture a year at the extension station and grew a garden that people who understood gardens drove from 3 counties to look at over the fence. She had heard at the extension office of a woodchip mountain. She had heard at the same extension office that the Ashby girl at the market asked the county agent questions nobody else asked. She came up to Marin's tailgate. She looked at the eggs. She looked at the milk crate. She looked at the small blue notebook lying on the tailgate beside the crate. She said, "May I see that?" Marin said, "The eggs, the notebook." Marin looked at her. There is a way one careful person recognizes another careful person, and it does not require conversation. Marin picked up the notebook. She handed it to Dr. Verity Kestrel without a word. Dr. Kestrel opened it. She flipped through the pages slow. Rainfall notes, pile temperatures, a pencil sketch of a fungal thread, a page of soil moisture readings from 3 different depths at the base of pile 2. A page where Marin had in her careful print written the CN ratios of oak chips, maple chips, hickory chips, coffee grounds, cow manure straw, and then drawn a small chart trying to figure out what the target ratio was for a hot compost that would not turn anaerobic on her. Dr. Kestrel closed the notebook. She handed it back. She said, "You are not just storing that man's waste up there, Miss Ashby. No, ma'am. You are watching decomposition." I don't know exactly what I'm watching, Dr. Kestrel. I know something is happening in those piles. I know they get hot in the middle. I know they cool down after 3 weeks or so. I know white threads spread through the shady, moist ones and not through the sunny, dry ones. I know one of my piles went sour last week and killed off everything living in it, and I know it did that because I packed it too tight. That is about what I know. Dr. Kestrel looked at her. She said, "Why do you think a forest floor builds rich, dark soil every year? Miss Ashby, without anyone ever fertilizing it." Marin thought about it. She thought about the woods behind her grandfather's barn, the soft black earth under the oaks, the layers of old leaves turning to something richer every autumn. She said, "Because something in there is eating it." Dr. Kestrel almost smiled. She said, "Now you are getting closer." She did not explain further. She never did. That Marin would learn was how Dr. Verity Kestrel taught. Dr. Kestrel bought a dozen eggs. She paid an exact change. She said before she turned to walk back to her small pickup, "Miss Ashby, when you decide you want to know what feeds on wood, come find me. I live at the end of Kestrel Hollow Road. There is a red mailbox. Come in the morning. Bring the notebook." She walked away. Marin stood at the tailgate of the Ranger and watched her go. She did not go that week. She wanted to. She did not. She went home that Saturday afternoon, and she sat on the porch steps of the leaning white farmhouse in the late afternoon sun, and she opened the notebook her grandfather had left in the top drawer of his father's roll-top desk, and she turned to the page dated July 11, 1983. She read the line again. "The pile ain't waste. It's a forest that ain't finished yet." She read the entry from October of the same year. Elmer laughed. Boyd's daddy laughed, stopped. She looked at the initial M, added in a different ink, later added at some point in the 20 years that had gone by between when Silas Ashby had abandoned this experiment and the day he had died standing at his kitchen window. She thought about Dr. Verity Kestrel. She thought about the photograph in the little back office, the woman in the canvas coat, the long braid. She stood up. She went back inside. She took the photograph down off the wall. She turned it over. On the back, in her grandmother's handwriting in ballpoint pen, she read the caption she had not thought to check. "Silas and Verity, 1983, first pile." Marin Ashby, 22 years old, sat down on the wooden floor of her grandfather's back office with the photograph in her hand, and for the first time since the phone call from Charlotte, she cried. She cried quiet. She cried with her hand pressed against her mouth so nobody at the barn or on the ridge or in the fog or on any road anywhere would hear her. She cried because she understood, without having yet been told, that whatever her grandfather had started in 1983 had not been his idea alone, and that whatever she had been sent home to finish had been waiting for her for 24 years in the top drawer of a roll-top desk, in the handwriting of a man who had known that one day the initial M was going to walk up the gravel drive with a shovel over her shoulder and say to a chip hauler at the door of a pickup the words, "Bring more." She dried her face on the sleeve of the caramel jacket. She stood up. She hung the photograph back on the wall. She went out to the piles. She stood at the base of pile 3, and she reached her hand into it, up to her elbow, and she felt the heat come up through her wrist and into her forearm. She thought about her grandfather at 60. She thought about Dr. Verity Kestrel in a canvas coat with a long braid. She thought about Devlin Rourke in his loafers looking at Little Sipsey Creek. She thought about Odette Ruthven at her desk in the little bank on Main Street. She thought about Boyd Threlkeld leaning on the fence. She thought about her mother who had not come to the funeral, who was 6 hours east in Charlotte, who had said to her on the phone the night before Silas died, "He is going to leave you nothing but debt, Marin. Don't you go up there." She thought about all of them, and she thought out loud so that only the pile could hear her, "I'm going to finish it, Grandpa." The wind moved the top of the pile half an inch. She stood there another minute. Then she walked back to the house. Because Monday morning was coming, and she had a note to make a first interest payment on, and she had a doctor to visit at the end of Kestrel Hollow Road. And she had in the small blue notebook in the pocket of her caramel jacket, in her own careful print, A list of questions that had begun on a Wednesday in April and had grown page by page into something that was not a list of questions anymore. It was the beginning of a book. She did not know that yet. But there was a man in a silver Lexus SUV in an office in Charlotte who had already begun to understand that the 22-year-old girl in Marlow County was not going to be the easy purchase he had been sold on. And there was a woman in a wool cap at the end of Kestrel Hollow Road who had begun to hope for the first time in 24 years that the work her sister Ione had begun in 1979 on a legal pad in a kitchen in Chapel Hill was not going to die with her. And there was a cattleman on the Western Ridge with a herd down to 43 head and a daughter with a hole in her heart who had begun without wanting to watch a girl he had called a fool and to wonder. The fog came down over the eastern ridge that night, the way it had come down the morning her grandfather died. Marin stood at the kitchen window and watched it. She did not stand where Silas had stood. She stood 2 feet to the left at the sink, where the light from the barn security bulb caught the edge of the counter and lit the small blue notebook lying open beside it. She stood there a long time. She drank a glass of water. She watched the fog come down over the piles at the low end of the pasture and cover them one by one until only the tallest of them showed as a soft, rounded shadow above the silver, and then even that was gone. She turned out the kitchen light. She went upstairs to the room with the blue and white quilt. She lay down in her clothes and closed her eyes. Downstairs in the drawer of the kitchen table, an unopened folded paper from a man named Devlin Rourke lay beside a letter from a woman named Odette Ruthven, and in the pocket of a caramel jacket hung over the back of a chair. A small blue notebook waited for morning. Kestrel Hollow Road ran up the flank of a mountain that had been named on no map Marin Ashby had ever seen. It was a gravel road that turned to dirt at the third switchback into something not quite either at the fourth. The morning she drove up it in the last week of July of 2007, the fog had already burned off the low ground, but was still hanging in the tops of the poplars, where the road bent hardest, and Marin drove slow with her window down and the small blue notebook on the passenger seat beside her, and she counted the mailboxes. There were 4. The fourth one was red. She turned in. The house at the end of the drive was small and set into the hillside, the way an old house is set into a hillside when it has been there long enough to belong to the ground under it. It had a green metal roof. There was a woodshed built onto the north side, and a greenhouse built onto the south side, and a chicken run behind the greenhouse. And behind the chicken run going up the slope in careful terraces was the garden that people drove from 3 counties to look at over the fence. Marin looked at it a long moment before she got out of the truck. She had never seen a garden like it. The rows were not straight. The rows followed the shape of the slope. The paths between them were narrow and grass-lined. There were fruit trees standing in among the vegetables. There were guinea hens working the aisles. Dr. Verity Kestrel came out of the greenhouse in a canvas apron with dirt on her forearms up to the elbows. She did not say good morning. She said, "Bring the notebook." She turned and walked toward the greenhouse without checking to see if Marin was following. Marin picked the notebook up off the passenger seat. She followed. Inside the greenhouse, the air was warm and green and smelled the way the woods behind the Ashby barn smelled after a September rain. There was a long potting bench along one wall. There were flats of seedlings under a grow light. There was a metal stool. Dr. Kestrel sat down on the stool. She indicated a low wooden crate flipped upside down beside the bench, and Marin sat down on the crate. Dr. Kestrel said, "Show me your best pile." "Ma'am, in the book, show me the best one, not the biggest, the best." Marin opened the notebook. She turned to a page from the 3rd week of June, where she had recorded in her careful print 21 days of temperature readings on pile 2, along with sketches of the fungal threads spreading from the shaded north face, and a note at the bottom that read, "White mycelium visible day 9 through day 16. Greatest concentration at 8-inch depth on the shaded side, none on the sun side." She handed the notebook to Dr. Kestrel. Dr. Kestrel read it slow. She said, "You are asking the wrong question. Ma'am, you are asking what is the temperature. That is a good question. It is not the first question. What is the first question? Dr. Kestrel handed the notebook back. She said, what is alive in there? Marin looked at her. Dr. Kestrel said, a compost pile is not a chemical reaction, Miss Ashby. It is not a stove. It is a small city. There are somewhere between 500 million and 2 billion living things in 1 tablespoon of finished compost. They are bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes, protozoa, nematodes, mites. Each of them does a job. Some of them break down the sugars first. Some of them come in after and break down the cellulose. Some of them come in last and break down the lignin, which is the hard woody part, which is what your chips are almost entirely made of. Each of these creatures wants a specific temperature and a specific moisture and a specific amount of oxygen. When you give them what they want, they multiply. When you give them the wrong thing, they die and something else moves in. Something else that stinks. Do you follow me? Yes, ma'am. So the first question is not what is the temperature. The first question is what is alive. The temperature is the answer the pile gives you to that question. If the pile is 131 at 8 inches, the pile is telling you that a particular kind of bacterium called a thermophile is doing well in there this week, which means the sugars and the easy carbohydrates are being eaten, which means in about 2 more weeks the temperature is going to drop because those bacteria will have run out of food. And then something else is going to move in and start on the harder stuff. And that something else in a pile of your kind of chips is mostly going to be fungi, which is what you saw on day 9. Marin wrote in the notebook fast, her pencil moving across the page. Dr. Kestrel watched her write. She said, Miss Ashby, do you know why your grandfather stopped in 83? Marin stopped writing. She looked up. She said, the men at the co-op laughed at him. Yes. He wrote that down. I know he did. Marin looked at her a long moment. She said, you knew him. I did. You worked with him. I did. The photograph in the office. That was me. There was a silence in the greenhouse for a long moment. A guinea hen made a noise outside. Dr. Kestrel's face did not move. Marin said, why didn't you say? Dr. Kestrel said, because you had to come to it yourself, Miss Ashby. He wrote your initial in that book. He wrote it in a different ink than the rest. He wrote it because he believed, and I don't know why he believed this, but he believed that one day a girl who read the way you read was going to sit at his desk and find that book. And I was not going to walk into your kitchen and tell you what to think about it. I was going to wait until you came here. How did you know I would come here? Because you asked the county agent last month what the CN ratio was on hickory chips versus coffee grounds, and he did not know, and you did not stop asking. He told me. He tells me every young farmer in this county who asks a question worth asking. There are not many. There were 3 in 20 years. You are the third. Marin said quiet, who were the other 2? Dr. Kestrel said, one of them was your grandfather in 1979. The other was my sister, Ione, in 1964. She stood up from the stool. She said, come with me. They walked out of the greenhouse and up the slope through the terrace garden past the guinea hens and the standing fruit trees and the rows of late summer crops. And at the top of the last terrace in the shade of a black walnut tree was a small stone marker set flat into the ground. The marker had 2 names on it. Ione Kestrel, 1936 to 1998, and on the second line, the first pile. Dr. Kestrel said, my sister drew the first sketch of a conical pile like the ones you are building down there. She drew it on a legal pad in the kitchen of the house we shared in Chapel Hill in 1979. She was working on her doctorate in soil ecology at the university. She died of a stroke at 62 before she ever saw one of those piles work the way she believed it would. Your grandfather and I worked with her. He was a farmer. I was a microbiologist. She was the ecologist. The 3 of us tried to run a small trial on his low pasture in 1983. We got 12 pretty good weeks out of it. Then the men at the co-op told him he was making a fool of himself, and he stopped. And I kept going up here on this hillside for another 24 years, and my sister died still believing it would work. And now you are down there on that same pasture with 8 of them going at once. Do you understand what I am telling you, Miss Ashby? Marin said, "Yes, ma'am. You are not starting something. I know. You are finishing something. I know." Dr. Kestrel looked at her a long moment. She said, "Then let us finish it." That was the beginning of it. For the rest of the summer of 2007, and through the fall and into the winter, Marin Ashby drove up Kestrel Hollow Road once a week on a Tuesday morning, and Dr. Verity Kestrel asked her one hard question at the beginning of the visit and one hard question at the end. And in between the two hard questions, Marin wrote in her notebook and listened. She learned the difference between a mesophilic phase and a thermophilic phase and a curing phase. She learned that the target ratio of carbon to nitrogen in a hot pile was somewhere around 30 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen, and that hardwood chips came in at close to 500 to 1, which was the reason a pile of nothing but chips would sit there for 2 years without becoming soil, and which was the reason Marin was going to have to bring in nitrogen from somewhere, or the piles were going to defeat her. She learned that oxygen mattered as much as moisture. She learned that a pile packed too tight went anaerobic and put out a gas that smelled like the inside of a sick stomach. She learned that a pile spread too thin, dried out, and killed everything living in it. She learned by failing. She failed a lot that fall. She failed pile 4 in September when she added too much cow manure from Boyd Threlkeld's backlot without balancing it with straw, and the pile went sour in a way she could smell from the porch. She failed pile 5 in October when she left it uncovered before a hard rain, and it saturated all the way through and cooled from 130 degrees at the core to 52 degrees in 18 hours, and every fungal thread in it turned to gray sludge overnight. She failed pile 6 in November when a cold snap came through, and she had not built the pile deep enough to hold its own heat, and the whole thing froze from the outside in and stopped in place. She wrote every failure down. She dated it. She priced it. She wrote what she had done wrong and what she thought she should have done. She brought the notes up Kestrel Hollow Road on Tuesdays, and Dr. Kestrel would look at them and ask one hard question, and Marin would drive back down the mountain and try again. She made her first interest payment on the note on the 15th of September, $208. She made it in cash across the counter to Odette Ruthven at the Marlow branch of Blue Ridge Community Bank and Trust, and Odette Ruthven counted the bills twice, stamped the receipt, and slid it across the counter to Marin with a look that was not quite pity and not quite something else. Odette Ruthven was 59 years old. She had known Silas Ashby since she was a girl. She had 2 grown sons in Raleigh and a husband on disability from a mill injury in the 90s. She said quiet enough that the woman behind Marin in line could not hear Miss Ashby. "The balloon comes due in 2 years. Do you know that?" "Yes, ma'am." "Do you have a plan?" "Yes, ma'am." "Does your plan involve those piles at your place?" "Yes, ma'am." Odette Ruthven looked at her. She said, "All right, honey, you come see me every quarter, not just when the interest is due. You come see me every quarter and you show me what you are doing up there. Because I am telling you now, and I should not be telling you this from behind this counter, but I am. There is a man in Charlotte who calls this branch twice a month to ask whether the Ashby note is current, and it is not idle curiosity." Marin looked at her a long moment. She said, "Thank you, Miss Ruthven." "Go on." She went on. She walked out of the bank into the November sun, and she stood in front of the little brick building on Main Street for a long minute before she got back in the Ranger. She thought about a man in Charlotte with his feet up on a walnut desk making phone calls twice a month to a branch manager in a small mountain town. She thought about the fold of paper Devlin Rourke had left on her fence post in July, still in the drawer of the kitchen table, still unopened. She thought about what $195,000 would look like in a bank account. Then she drove home and turned pile 2 with a pitchfork for 2 hours in the cold, and by dark she had stopped thinking about it. Winter that year was long. Snow came in the second week of December. It stayed. There was a stretch in January when the temperature did not rise above 22 degrees for 11 straight days, and Marin spent those days in the barn splitting cordwood and mending a section of the roof where the tin had rusted through above the loft. Harlan Beckett kept bringing chips. He brought them on Fridays in the snow in a truck with chains on the back tires. He never asked her to explain. He never asked her when she was going to stop. Once in the middle of January on a Friday afternoon, so cold the diesel in his truck was gelling, he stood in the low pasture with her while she pointed out the piles that were still steaming and the ones that had gone dormant. And he said, without taking his eyes off the tallest pile, "Your granddaddy would be proud of you, Miss Ashby. Marin said you knew him all my life. Did he ever talk to you about the piles?" Harlan Beckett was quiet a moment. Then he said once, in 1982, he came into the mill and asked my daddy what we did with our sawdust. My daddy told him, "We piled it in the back lot and burned it in the fall." Your granddaddy asked if he could have a truckload for an experiment. My daddy laughed at him. Your granddaddy took a truckload anyway. It was the last time he ever asked us for anything. 25 years he bought firewood off us and never asked for another thing. Marin looked at him. She said, "Mr. Beckett." "Ma'am, I am sorry your daddy laughed at him." Harlan Beckett shook his head slow. He said, "So am I, Miss Ashby. So am I. That's part of why I keep bringing the chips." He got back in the truck. He drove down the switchback in the snow with the chains rattling. Marin stood at the edge of pile 3 and watched him go. And then she wrote 3 lines in the notebook, and one of them was the sentence Harlan Beckett had just said, and she underlined it, and she went inside. The first real spring rain came on a Tuesday in the middle of April of 2008. It rained hard for 6 hours. The next morning, Marin walked the low pasture at first light. She was checking the drainage on the piles. She was checking whether any of them had slumped. She got to pile 6, which was the newest and which was the biggest, in which she had been building for 6 weeks, in a shape she and Dr. Kestrel had designed together, wider at the base and taller in the middle, and with a small ventilation core of coarse brush running up through the center of it, and she smelled it before she got within 20 feet. It smelled bad. It smelled the way she knew from pile 4 in September that anaerobic went. It smelled like something that was living had died overnight, and something else that was not going to help her had moved in. She walked around it. The south side of the pile had settled. The lower third had compacted under its own weight after the rain, and the air pockets she had built in with the coarse brush had collapsed. She could see it in the shape of the pile. She could smell it in the shape of the pile. She stood there at 7 in the morning in the April cold with her hands in the pockets of the caramel jacket, and she thought, all right, so this one is dead. She did not cry. She wrote it down. She wrote, Pile 6 anaerobic collapse day. 43 south face slumped after 2-inch rain, ventilation core. Insufficient smell, hydrogen sulfide. Active fungi absent, will need to be broken down and rebuilt. She was closing the notebook when she saw the county truck. It was coming up the switchback slow, a white Ford F-150 with the Marlow County seal on the driver's side door. Marin stood at the base of pile 6 and watched it come. The truck pulled up in front of the barn. The door opened. A man got out. I was 63 years old. He was 6'1". He wore a khaki uniform shirt with a small brass name tag that said Hooks. His full name was Delmar Hooks, and he had been the Marlow County Health and Environmental Compliance Officer for 19 years. He was not a mean man. He was not a friendly man. He was a man who had a job. He walked down from the barn to pile 6. He said, Miss Ashby, Mr. Hooks, you know why I'm here. I have a guess. There has been a complaint filed. Yes, sir. About the odor. Yes, sir. I'm required by the county code to respond to any complaint of this kind within 48 hours. That is why I am here today. I do not have to tell you who filed the complaint. I am not going to tell you who filed the complaint. What I am here to do is inform you that the county has determined the source of the odor is your property, and that under Section 9 of the Marlow County Nuisance Ordinance, you have 30 days to remediate the condition, or the county will proceed with enforcement, which will include a fine of $250 per day of continued violation, and if necessary, an injunction requiring you to remove all of these piles from the parcel. He handed her a paper. Marin took it. She read the top line. Notice of nuisance violation. She read the middle. 30 days from date of service. She said, Mr. Hooks. Yes, ma'am. I understand. Thank you for coming out. Delmar Hooks looked at her. I had been prepared for a woman in tears. He had been prepared for a woman shouting. He had been prepared for a woman calling a lawyer. He had not been prepared for a 22-year-old girl in a caramel jacket saying thank you for coming out. He said, Miss Ashby, I'm not doing this because I want to. I know. I have known your granddaddy since I was a boy. I know. The complaint came from someone I would not have expected. She looked at him. He looked back at her. He did not say the name. He did not have to. He said, you have 30 days. He walked back to his truck. He drove down the switchback. Myron stood at the base of pile 6 with the paper in her hand and the smell of hydrogen sulfide in her nose. And after a long moment, she folded the paper into thirds and put it in the pocket of the caramel jacket, and she walked back up to the house, and she called Kestrel Hollow Road. Dr. Kestrel picked up on the third ring. Myron said pile 6 went anaerobic. Dr. Kestrel said, how bad? Bad enough the county came out. I have 30 days to remediate or they fine me $250 a day. There was a pause on the line. Dr. Kestrel said, who filed the complaint? Hooks wouldn't say. You know who did? I have a guess. Then that is your first problem. Come up tomorrow morning. We are going to break that pile down and we are going to rebuild it. And I am going to tell you what the ratio actually needs to be for a wood chip pile at scale, which is a thing I have been waiting for you to be ready to know for 6 months. She hung up. Marin stood at the kitchen counter with the phone in her hand for a full minute. Then she put the phone down. She looked at the window her grandfather had died at. She looked at the piece of cardboard that was still 13 months later taped over the broken pane because she had not replaced it, because replacing it had felt all this time like closing a door she was not ready to close. She said out loud, all right. She replaced the pane that afternoon. She drove to the hardware store in Marlow, bought a piece of glass cut to size, drove home, took the cardboard down, set the glass in with fresh glazing putty. It took her an hour and a half. When she was done, she stood at the window and looked east at the ridge and at the low pasture with the 8 steaming piles and the 1 dead one. And she thought, Grandpa, I know who filed the complaint. And I am not angry with him. And I am going to fix the pile. And then I am going to go over there, and I am going to ask him why. She did not go the next day. She went up Kestrel Hollow Road the next day, and she and Dr. Kestrel spent 9 hours breaking down pile 6 with pitchforks and rebuilding it in a new configuration. Dr. Kestrel drew out on the back of an envelope, and by the time Marin drove back down the mountain that night in the dark, she had a new CN ratio, a new moisture protocol, a new ventilation design, and a working understanding of why a fungal dominant pile behaved differently than a bacterial dominant pile in the second week of the thermophilic phase. She was so tired she could not feel her hands on the wheel of the Ranger. She rebuilt pile 6 over the next 4 days. She hauled in 12 bales of last year's straw from a hayman over in Rutherford County. She drove to the diner in Marlow, a place called the Nickel Run by a woman named Merla Prine, and asked Merla for her used coffee grounds. Merla, a small, round woman of 68 who had known Silas Ashby since kindergarten, listened to Marin's request, wiped her hands on her apron, and said, Honey, I have been throwing out 4 gallons of coffee grounds a day for 41 years. You want them, you come by every Monday and Thursday at 6 in the morning, and you can have every one. She said it without hesitation. She said it without asking why. She said it the way a woman of a certain age in a small town says a thing when she has decided on the spot that helping the girl in front of her is going to be the one useful thing she does this week. Marin said, Merla, thank you. Merla said, don't thank me, honey, just don't stop. So the diner grounds came in. The straw came in. The manure came from a neighbor 2 miles further down the road, a widower named Otis Halcombe, who kept 6 goats and had more manure than he knew what to do with. Marin mixed the chips with the straw and the grounds in the manure at a ratio Dr. Kestrel had drawn on the back of the envelope, and she built pile 6 back up in 5 layers, watering each layer to the point where the material glistened but did not drip. And she left a proper ventilation core in the middle this time, made not of coarse brush, but of a bundle of perforated PVC pipe that Dr. Kestrel had produced from her woodshed. And by day 9 of the rebuild, the pile was at 134 degrees at 8 inches down, and the smell was not hydrogen sulfide anymore. The smell was faintly like something in the woods after a September rain. She finished the remediation 3 days ahead of the county's deadline. Delmar Hooks came back on the 27th day. He walked around pile 6. He put a probe thermometer in it. He read it. He walked around it again. He walked around piles 1 through 5. He walked around piles 7 and 8. He stopped at the base of pile 2, which had been curing since October, and which had begun in places to look like something that was no longer a pile of chips, but a pile of something else. He said, "Miss Ashby, Mr. Hooks, this place does not smell the way it smelled 3 weeks ago." "No, sir. That pile that went bad, it is not going bad anymore." "No, sir. You want to tell me what you did?" Marin considered for a moment. Then she said, "I got the ratio wrong, Mr. Hooks. I did not have enough nitrogen for the carbon load. So the biology inside the pile could not process the material fast enough, and the pile packed down under its own weight, and the air ran out, and a different set of bacteria took over that produce a gas that smells the way that smelled. To fix it, I had to break the pile back down, add straw and coffee grounds and manure to bring the nitrogen up and rebuild it with a proper ventilation core so oxygen can reach the middle. It is a live thing, Mr. Hooks. If you feed it wrong, it dies bad. If you feed it right, it works." Delmar Hooks looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You learned all that in 27 days. "No, sir. I learned it in 11 months. The 27 days is how long it took me to fix it." He almost smiled. He said, "I am closing the file, Miss Ashby. There is no violation on this parcel today. I want you to know something." "Yes, sir." "The complaint came from Boyd Threlkeld." Marin looked at him. She had known, but she had not quite known. She said, "I appreciate you telling me." He said, "That's not why I'm telling you. I am telling you because Boyd Threlkeld drove into the county office 3 days ago and tried to withdraw the complaint. He said he had not meant it the way it looked. He said he had a daughter with a bad heart, and he was under some pressure that had made him do something he would not have done ordinarily, and he wanted me to know it before I came back out here. I told him I could not withdraw the complaint, but I could note the withdrawal request in the file, which I did." Marin stood very still. Delmar Hooks said, "I do not know what pressure Boyd Threlkeld is under, Miss Ashby, but I have known that man since he was a boy, and he does not file complaints against neighbors for sport. Somebody put him up to it. I thought you might want to know." He tipped the brim of the county cap. He got in the truck. He drove down the switchback slow. Marin stood at the base of pile 6 with the sun on her face and the smell of forest floor coming faint off the pile. And she thought about Boyd Threlkeld, and about a daughter with a bad heart, and about a man in Charlotte with his feet up on a walnut desk. And she understood then, the way she had understood on the porch in July, with her grandfather's photograph in her hand, that everything about this ranch had always been about something else at the same time. She walked over to the fence line that afternoon. Boyd Threlkeld was in his back lot forking hay into a bunk for the 43 head that were by then 41. He saw her coming. He set the fork down. He walked slow to the fence and took his cap off. He said, "Marin, Boyd, you know, Hooks told me. I'm sorry. Why did you do it?" Boyd Threlkeld looked at the ground between them. He said, "There is a man been coming around Marin, Devlin Rourke. Comes up in a silver SUV. He come and see me in the middle of March. Said his firm was buying parcels along Marlow Ridge Road. Said they was interested in mine. Said they'd pay above appraisal for it. And he said it real casual, like it was just a fact. He said, 'We're closing on the Ashby parcel first.' He said, 'We're closing on the Ashby parcel first, and once that closes, all the parcels around it get a bump. So when we come to yours, it'll be worth more.'" Marin said, "But I have not sold." Boyd Threlkeld looked up. He said, I know that now, but he said it like it was done. He said it like it was already done. And Marin, my Junie. I know about Junie. She is 8 years old. The doctor in Asheville told us last fall she has a hole in her heart the size of a nickel. They want to do the surgery at Duke. It is going to cost, after what the insurance covers, it is going to cost us $48,000. I do not have $48,000. I do not have $4,000. Rourke came to me and said if the Ashby thing does not close, my number for your parcel goes down. He said your piles were slowing the county process. He said if I could raise a concern about the smell, it would help the county move faster on your parcel. He said, Boyd Threlkeld stopped. He said, I filed the complaint. I did not think it was going to be like it was. I thought it was going to be a letter. I did not know Hooks was going to come out. I did not know they was going to give you 30 days. I was already trying to take it back when I saw Hooks's truck come up your drive. I am not going to ask you to forgive me, Marin. I am telling you because you should know. And because I need you to know, I am not going to do it again. Marin looked at him a long moment. She said, Boyd. Yeah. Junie surgery. Yeah. There is a doctor at Chapel Hill named Whitaker. He is a pediatric cardiologist. He runs a program for families in Western North Carolina who can't afford the deductible. I know about the program because my grandfather sat on the board of a small grant fund that used to feed into it in the 90s. I am going to call the fund tonight. I am going to see whether the program is still running. If it is, I am going to give you the number, whether we ever speak again or not. Boyd Threlkeld's eyes filled. He turned his head so that she would not see it, but his shoulders shook once and he made no sound. He said hoarse, Marin. She said, I do not have to forgive you, Boyd, and you do not have to forgive yourself. What we have to do is not do it again. Both of us. I am going to make my payment in September. You are going to make Junie surgery, and Devlin Rourke is not going to get either of us. That is what we are going to do. She turned and walked back across her side of the pasture. Boyd Threlkeld stood at his side of the fence for a long time with his cap in his hand. When he finally turned to go back to the hay bunk, he was not the same man who had walked up to the fence that afternoon. He was a man who had been forgiven without asking for it, which is a thing that happens in a lifetime once or twice, and which changes a man in ways he does not always have the words for. She called the fund that night. The program was still running. She got Boyd the number. 2 weeks later, Boyd and his wife Deanie drove Junie to Chapel Hill, and Dr. Whitaker's office set her up with an intake appointment. And by the middle of May, the surgery was scheduled for August, and the fund was covering the deductible. Boyd Threlkeld did not come to Marin's fence line to thank her. He came light on the morning after the scheduling call, and he mucked out her chicken coop and split half a cord of firewood before she had come downstairs, and he had gone home again by the time she came out onto the porch with her coffee, and there was a note on the porch rail in his blocky handwriting that said only neighbor, BT. She kept the note. It went in the drawer of the kitchen table next to the folded paper from Devlin Rourke, and next to the letter from Odette Ruthven, and next to the notice of nuisance violation from Delmar Hooks, and next to the photograph of Silas and Verity in 1983, which she had by then taken off the wall of the little back office and moved into the drawer with the rest, because she had begun, without quite realizing it, to gather the pieces of a story that was not yet finished, but that she was going to have to tell somebody someday in its entirety. Devlin Rourke came back on the last Tuesday of May. He did not come alone. He came in the silver Lexus SUV, but this time there was a second vehicle behind him, a dark blue Cadillac sedan with Charlotte plates. And out of the Cadillac stepped a woman Marin had not seen in 14 months. Her name was Rowena Ashby. She was 49 years old. She was 5'2". She was Silas Ashby's only daughter and Marin's mother, and she had not attended her own father's funeral, and she did not know how to stand on a switchback in Western North Carolina without her heels sinking into the gravel, and she was standing there now with her arms folded and her lipstick fresh and her eyes on the piles. Devlin Rourke said, Miss Ashby, I've brought your mother up from Charlotte. I thought we could all sit down. Marin did not answer him. She looked at her mother. Her mother said, Marin, Mama, we need to talk, honey. Marin stood in the drive between the two vehicles and the 8 piles in the leaning white farmhouse, and she felt the weight of the small blue notebook in the pocket of her caramel jacket, and she thought about the drawer of the kitchen table, and she thought about her grandfather at the window, and she thought about Dr. Verity Kestrel in the greenhouse, asking her what was alive in there, and she thought about Boyd Threlkeld at the fence, with his cap in his hand and his eyes wet, and she thought about Odette Ruthven counting bills across the counter of the bank, and about Merla Prine saving coffee grounds in gallon buckets behind the diner, and about Delmar Hooks closing the file, and about Harlan Beckett bringing chips in the snow. She thought about all of them. Then she looked at her mother and at Devlin Rourke standing beside her mother in his khaki jacket with too many pockets, and she said, "All right, come inside, both of you." She turned and walked toward the house. Neither of them saw the way her hand in the pocket of the caramel jacket closed around the small blue notebook and held it hard the way a person holds a warm stone in a cold pocket. Neither of them saw the way before she opened the front door. She paused on the porch for a full second and looked east toward the ridge and toward the fog that was in the last hour of the afternoon, beginning to come down from the wooded top of the mountain, the way it had come down on the morning her grandfather had died. She opened the door. She went inside. She held it open behind her. They followed her in. The screen door closed behind them with a soft catch, and the light in the yard changed, and the piles on the low pasture stood in the last of the sun without moving. The kitchen was smaller than Rowena Ashby remembered. That was the first thing she said, standing in the doorway of the room where her father had died, taking in the counter and the stove, and the newly reglazed window, and the small blue notebook lying open on the table where her mother's twist-tie drawer had been. She said it under her breath the way a woman says a thing to herself that she has been holding for 14 months, and she said it in a voice that was not quite unkind, only tired. Marin said, "Sit down, Mama, please, both of you." Devlin Rourke sat. Rowena Ashby did not sit at first. She walked to the window instead. She put her fingertips on the fresh glazing putty around the new pane. She turned her head and looked at the cardboard patch that was no longer there. Then she sat down slow at the head of the table, in the chair her father had used to eat from every morning of his life, and she did not seem to know she had chosen that chair, and Marin did not say anything about it. Marin poured 3 cups of coffee. She set the first one in front of her mother. She set the second one in front of Devlin Rourke. She kept the third one in her own hand and did not sit. She said, "You want to talk, talk." Devlin Rourke opened a soft leather portfolio and set it on the table. He said, "Miss Ashby, since we last spoke in July, my client has authorized me to revise the offer. We are now prepared to move to $210,000. That is the top of our budget for this parcel. It clears the note, it settles the estate, it leaves you and your mother with $178,000 in liquid distribution after closing costs. We are prepared to close in 30 days. Rowena said, "Marin, honey, listen to him." "I am listening, Mama. $210,000 is more money than my daddy ever saw in his life. I know that. That is life-changing money for the two of us. I know it is. Then take it, and come home." Marin looked at her mother a long moment. She said, "Mama, where is home?" Rowena Ashby did not answer. Devlin Rourke slid a document out of the portfolio. It was 31 pages long. It was bound with a plastic comb. He said, "Miss Ashby, I have brought the full purchase agreement. I would ask you to look through it. Take your time. I am not asking for a signature today. I am asking you to read it." Marin said, "I'll read it." She took the agreement from him. She sat down at the table for the first time. She opened the front cover. She read the first page. She read the second. Devlin Rourke drank his coffee and watched her over the rim of the cup. Rowena Ashby watched her over the tops of her folded hands. The kitchen was quiet enough that Marin could hear the tick of the refrigerator compressor cycling in the pantry. She turned pages slow. She read every line. She reached page 19. She stopped. She read the paragraph on page 19 twice. She read it a third time. She looked up. She said, "Mr. Rourke." "Yes, ma'am." "On page 19, paragraph 4, subparagraph B." Yes, ma'am. There is a provision here that says, and I am reading it now, seller hereby transfers assigns and quit claims to purchaser in perpetuity any and all riparian rights, downstream water claims, water rights of record in associated hydrological interests attaching to any surface water body, tributary or watercourse traversing, bordering, or originating upon the described parcel. Am I reading that correctly? Devlin Rourke did not blink. He said, yes, ma'am. That is a standard provision in our purchase agreements. Marin said, Mr. Rourke, Little Sipsey Creek runs through my 48 and then through 6 more parcels downhill before it joins the Broad River. Every one of those 6 parcels has a well. 2 of them have small hydro on the creek itself. If I sign that provision, I am signing away not only my water, but any interest I could ever raise in what happens to that creek downstream of me. My signature on page 19 would attach to your firm the entire riparian chain of Little Sipsey. Rowena said, Marin, honey, this is technical language. Marin did not look at her. She said, Mr. Rourke, am I wrong? Devlin Rourke was silent a moment. Then he said, you are not wrong. So this is not a purchase agreement for a cabin development. Miss Ashby, this is a water rights instrument dressed up as a real estate transaction. Your firm did not come to Marlow County for hospitality. Your firm came here to build a water portfolio. There is a highway spur being surveyed through the eastern side of this county for a Department of Transportation project that has not yet been publicly announced. And whichever party controls the riparian rights along Little Sipsey, when that spur breaks ground, is going to receive a very large settlement from the state for water impacts. Am I still not wrong? Devlin Rourke set his coffee down. He said, Miss Ashby, you are not required to sign the water rights transfer. That provision can be struck with no reduction in price, with a corresponding reduction in price. How much? He did not answer. Marin said, how much, Mr. Rourke? He said, the parcel without the riparian transfer is worth to us in the neighborhood of $85,000. Rowena Ashby said 80. Marin said, so the 48 acres are worth 85,000 to you, and the water rights alone are worth 125. That is not how we would characterize it, Miss Ashby. That is how the paper characterizes it, Mr. Rourke. She closed the agreement. She slid it back across the table to him. She said, take this with you when you go. Rowena said, Marin, Mama. Marin, listen to me. Even $85,000 is enough to clear your daddy's note and give you a fresh start. You can walk away from this place. You do not have to sign the water. You can keep the creek. You can keep it as an easement or however that works. Just take the 85. Take it and let this place go. Marin looked at her mother. She said quiet, Mama, do you remember the last time you talked to Grandpa? Rowena Ashby's face did not change, but the muscle at the corner of her jaw moved. She said, Christmas of '99. Do you remember what he said to you? He said he was disappointed in me. He said more than that. I don't remember. You do remember. Rowena Ashby closed her eyes for a moment. He said, Rowena, someday, my only granddaughter is going to have to make a decision about this ground, and I want to be able to tell her when she comes to me for advice that her mother had the sense to stay out of the way. And I told him that his ground had killed his wife with worry and had killed his son with debt and had cost me my father before I was 30. And I told him I never wanted to hear about the ground again, and I meant it. Marin said, you meant it, Mama. I did. You still mean it. I do. Then stay out of the way. Rowena Ashby looked at her daughter. She had not been looked at that way by her own daughter in a long time. Maybe ever. She had been looked at that way once by a man in a kitchen in 1999, and she had walked out and driven to Charlotte in a snowstorm and had not come back. And that same look was in her daughter's face now, and it did not have anger in it. That was the worst part of it. It did not have anger in it. It had only clarity. Rowena Ashby stood up. She said, Mr. Rourke, I would like to go. Devlin Rourke stood. He said, Miss Ashby, my offer stays open for 30 days. Take the time. Read the agreement again with a lawyer. My number is in the packet. Marin said, you know my answer. He said, I know today's answer. She looked at him. She said, Mr. Rourke, there will not be a different answer. I gathered the portfolio. He walked to the door. Rowena Ashby followed him without looking back at her daughter. On the porch, she paused, and for a second, Marin thought her mother was going to say something. But Rowena Ashby only stood there a moment, and then she walked down the porch steps to the Cadillac, and she got in the passenger side and closed the door, and Devlin Rourke drove them down the switchback in the dying afternoon light. Marin stood in the kitchen alone. She stood there until she could no longer hear the tires on the gravel. Then she sat down at the table. She opened the small blue notebook. She turned to a fresh page. She dated it. She wrote 3 lines. Rourke 210, water clause on page 19, struck 85. Mama came with him. Mama left with him. Grandpa knew this day was coming. She underlined the last line. She sat at the table for a long time after that. The light in the room turned amber, and then rose, and then blue. And by the time she stood up to turn on the lamp, the fog was down over the low pasture, and the piles could not be seen from the window at all. And Marin Ashby, 22 years old, alone in a kitchen where her grandfather had died, understood that whatever came next was not going to be about her mother. Rowena Ashby did not call for 6 months. Marin did not call her either. That summer was hot and dry, but not the killing kind. There was rain enough to keep the pastures green through July and to keep the piles working the way they were supposed to work. Marin finished her second full year on the ranch. She made the June interest payment in cash. She made the September interest payment in cash. Odette Ruthven counted the September bills and stamped the receipt and slid it across. And this time Odette Ruthven said, quiet, 12 months to the balloon, honey. Do you have it in you? Marin said, yes, ma'am. I think I do. You come see me in January. I will. She kept coming to see her. She kept driving up Kestrel Hollow Road on Tuesday mornings. She kept meeting Harlan Beckett at the gate on Fridays and directing the newest load to the site she had marked in lime that morning. Boyd Threlkeld's Junie had her surgery in August of 2008 at the University of North Carolina Children's Hospital in Chapel Hill. The surgery took 11 hours. It closed the hole in her heart. She came home to Marlow County in the second week of September on a gray afternoon, and Boyd Threlkeld carried her from the truck to the porch of their small house. And Deanie Threlkeld stood on the porch step with her hand pressed to her mouth, watching them come. And Junie, who was pale as new paper, but smiling, waved across the fence line at Marin, who was standing at the base of pile 3 with a pitchfork, and Marin raised her hand and waved back. That was in '08. The winter of '08 to '09 was the coldest winter Marlow County had seen in 11 years. Marin spent it curing compost, splitting firewood, and reading. Dr. Kestrel gave her books. A book on soil biology by a woman named Ingham. A book on regenerative agriculture by a man named Fukuoka. A book on watershed ecology that Dr. Kestrel's sister, Ione, had written in 1992, 3 years before her stroke, that had been published by a university press and had sold 412 copies, and was, in Dr. Kestrel's opinion, one of the 3 most important books on land management written in the 20th century. Marin read them all. She read them with the small blue notebook open beside her, and she underlined sentences and copied out passages. And by the end of the winter, her blue notebook had begun to look like a book itself. It had 6 colors of ink in it. It had folded diagrams tucked between pages. It had on the last page a rough chart of everything she had learned from Dr. Kestrel about the 6 phases a well-managed hardwood pile goes through in the first 18 months of its life. And the chart looked, Marin thought when she looked at it, like the kind of thing a person could someday teach from. In April of 2009, on a Wednesday morning that smelled of wet cedar and diesel smoke, and the raw earth that shows up after a winter thaw, Marin Ashby, 24 years old now, walked out to pile 2, which had been standing since October of 2007, and she took a shovel and dug 6 inches down into the base of it, and the shovel came up not with chips, it came up with soil, It came up with soft, dark, crumbling black earth. It came up with earthworms threaded through it, more earthworms in one shovelful than she had ever seen in her life. It came up smelling the way the woods behind the barn smelled after a September rain. It came up looking like something that had lived a long life and had at last become the thing it had been trying to become since the first Friday of 2007. She sat back on her heels. She let the soil fall through her fingers back into the ditch she had made with the shovel. She did not cry. She had not cried since the porch in July of 2007 with her grandfather's photograph in her hand. She had since then done a lot of things, and crying had not been one of them. She said out loud so that only the pile could hear her, "Grandpa, look." The wind did not move. She stood up. She walked back to the house. She got a 5-gallon bucket. She filled the bucket with the finished compost from pile 2. She drove into Marlowe. She drove to Merla Prine's diner. She carried the bucket in through the back door past the coffee grinder and the walk-in cooler into the little office where Merla kept her books. And she set the bucket on Merla's desk and she said, "Merla, this is what your coffee grounds have been becoming." Merla Prine looked at the bucket. She reached in with her hand. She lifted a handful of the compost. She held it against her palm. She smelled it. She looked at Marin. She said, "Honey, is that what dirt is supposed to look like?" Marin said, "Yes, ma'am. That is what dirt is supposed to look like." Merla said, "I have been throwing out dirt for 41 years." Marin said, "Not anymore." Merla Prine, 69 years old. That spring put the compost back in the bucket, wiped her hand on her apron, walked out to the diner floor and told every one of her Wednesday morning regulars that the Ashby girl up on the ridge had turned coffee grounds into black gold, and that anybody who wanted a sample could come by after Sunday church and pick up a small paper bag from the counter free. By that afternoon, 4 people had stopped by. By the end of the week, 11. By the end of April, Marin Ashby had sold at the Marlowe Farmers Market 38 small paper sacks of finished compost at $3 a sack. It was not much money, but it was money that had come out of the piles. It was money that had come out of the ground. It was in the small blue notebook on the page dated April 27 of 2009, a line that read, "First sale of finished product. Total received to date $114. Under it, she wrote, "Balloon in 5 months, need approximately 31,800 more." She underlined the second line. She started thinking harder about scale. She talked to Harlan Beckett. She asked him whether Beckett's sawmill would be interested in a small side operation of separating chips by species and selling them not to Marin, but to a compost operation. Marin was going to run out of the low pasture at a formal rate that would clean up the cash flow on his side and give him a legitimate revenue line for what had been, since April of '07, a giveaway. Harlan Beckett listened to her. He listened to her the way he had listened to her the first Friday she had said, "Bring more." He said, "Miss Ashby, if you can pay me even $1 a cubic yard, I will separate every load by species. I will label each one, and I will sign a contract." She said, "$2 a yard, and I want first refusal on cherry. Cherry is worth more to me because it cures faster and has a better crumb." He said, "You are the buyer, ma'am. You set the terms." They signed a 1-page agreement at the sawmill office on a Tuesday afternoon. That was in the middle of May of 2009. By the end of May, Marin had approached the small garden center in Marlowe with a proposal. She would supply them with 200 sacks of finished compost at retail-ready weight, at wholesale, if they would carry it under a label she had designed herself in an evening at the kitchen table. The label said in a hand that was Marin's own, "Mountain Soil Works, Marlowe County, NC, Hardwood Compost, 6-month cure." Below the name she had drawn a small conical pile in profile, the way her grandfather had drawn one in the notebook in 1983. The garden center's owner, a woman named Lorraine Trask, who was 64 and who had known Silas Ashby since childhood, looked at the label for a long moment, and then she said, "Honey, put 400 sacks in my back lot by Memorial Day, and I will pay you cash on delivery." Marin delivered 400 sacks on Memorial Day. Lorraine Trask paid her $1,440. The Mountain Soil Works name traveled. It traveled slow. It traveled the way names travel in farm country, which is to say from porch to porch, from Sunday dinner to Sunday dinner, from one back fence conversation to another. By the middle of June, Marin had received phone calls from 3 landscape contractors within 30 miles who wanted to know whether she could supply them by the yard for erosion control jobs. She could. By the middle of July, a small orchard down in Rutherford County had ordered 18 cubic yards of finished compost to top dress a young block of heritage apple trees. That single order was $6,000. She wrote the check in the notebook. She underlined it. She was still not going to make the balloon. She had until September 15th. She had, by the third week of July, $17,200 in an old cigar box in the closet of the upstairs bedroom, and she needed $32,400 by the 15th of September. And the piles were curing, but the piles were not going to give her $15,000 more dollars in 52 days. She went to Odette Ruthven. She sat across the counter. She said, "Miss Ruthven, I need a 60-day extension on the balloon." Odette Ruthven took off her reading glasses. She said, "I cannot give you that, honey." "I know. My hands are tied. The note is what the note is." "I know. Have you got the money?" "I have half." "Half is not enough, Marin." "I know." Odette Ruthven looked at her. She said, "Do you have collateral?" Marin said, "I have compost." Odette Ruthven said, "Compost is not collateral, honey. Compost is inventory. The bank does not lend against inventory." "I know. Do you have a buyer?" Marin said, "I have 3 buyers. I have a garden center in Marlow. I have 3 landscape contractors. I have an orchard in Rutherford. I have letters of intent from all of them for standing orders through the fall." Odette Ruthven said, "Bring me those letters." Marin brought her the letters the next morning. Odette Ruthven read them. She said, "Give me until Friday." On Friday, she called Marin at home. She said, "Marin, the bank is not going to do it." I asked. The regional took one look at those letters and said, inventory-backed lending was not something they were prepared to entertain for an unsecured agricultural business under 3 years old. But I did something else on my own time. I called a woman I went to college with who runs a small community lending fund out of Asheville. It is called the Blue Ridge Farm Futures Fund. They make bridge loans to young agricultural operators. She is going to call you on Monday. Do not miss the call. Marin said, "Miss Ruthven." "Don't, just answer the phone." The call came on Monday at 10 in the morning. The woman's name was Beulah Ledford. She was 70 years old. She had co-founded the Blue Ridge Farm Futures Fund in 1992 after a career at the North Carolina Department of Agriculture. She listened to Marin for 18 minutes without interrupting. She asked to see the letters of intent, the Beckett sawmill contract, the extension circular that Dr. Kestrel had by then, with Marin's permission submitted for peer review to a small journal in soil ecology, the sample bag of finished compost, and one afternoon on the ranch with Dr. Kestrel present. She got all of it. She came up the switchback in a battered green Subaru on the second Friday of August. She walked the piles with Dr. Kestrel and Marin for 3 hours. She probed pile temperatures. She smelled the finished product. She looked at pile 2 and pile 3, both of which by then were producing finished compost at a rate of 8 cubic yards a week. She looked at the label on a Mountain Soil Works bag. She looked at Marin. She said, "Miss Ashby, I am prepared to approve a bridge loan of $18,000 at 4% repayable over 36 months secured against your standing orders and against a first lien on your inventory of finished product. That will bring you to $35,200, which will cover the balloon and closing costs and give you a small buffer. Do you accept?" Marin said, "Yes, ma'am." They signed papers at the diner in Marlow on a Tuesday at a booth in the back, with Merla Prine bringing them coffee and refusing to charge for it. Marin walked into the Marlow branch of Blue Ridge Community Bank and Trust on the 10th of September of 2009, 4 days ahead of the balloon deadline, and she laid on the counter in front of Odette Ruthven a certified check from the Blue Ridge Farm Futures Fund in the amount of $18,000 in a cashier's check from her own account, in the amount of $17,400. And Odette Ruthven counted the two together, and she said quiet, balloon plus closing costs. Yes. She stamped the note paid in full. She turned it around and slid it across the counter to Marin. She said, Miss Ashby, congratulations. Marin said, thank you, Miss Ruthven. She put the paid note in an envelope. She walked out of the bank. She stood in the September sun on Main Street for a full minute, and then she walked across the street to the diner, and she went in the back door, and she gave Merla Prine a bag of finished compost, the size of a bag of flour, and she said, for your begonias. And Merla Prine, who was standing at the flat top with a spatula in her hand, looked at the bag, and then she looked at Marin, and she took her apron off, and she hugged Marin so hard that a busboy who was carrying 2 plates of eggs stopped in the aisle and did not move for a full 10 seconds. Merla said, your granddaddy is watching. Marin said, I know. The next thing that happened was the drought. The drought came in the summer of 2011. It was the worst drought Marlow County had seen in 40 years. It started dry in the second week of April, and by the middle of June, the pastures along Marlow Ridge Road were the color of straw. And by the middle of July, the stock tanks were low, and by the 1st of August, Boyd Threlkeld had lost 8 head of cattle to heat and thin forage, and the men down at the Beckett Sawmill diner counter were saying it was 56 all over again. The ridge did not save everyone, but it saved the ones who had built for it. Marin's low pasture, restored in patches by 4 years of finished compost, held moisture like a sponge. The soil under her young fruit trees stayed dark and cool 6 inches down when the ground on Boyd Threlkeld's side of the fence had cracked open along the surface. The vegetable beds she had spread with a 2-inch top dress of Mountain Soil Works in April kept producing through July. The little cover crops she had planted between the beds at Dr. Kestrel's suggestion held the surface soil in place against the wind that came howling up the valley in the last week of July and pulled dust off the Threlkeld pasture in thin brown ribbons visible from the porch. On the 21st of July, Boyd Threlkeld walked from his back lot down to the fence line. Marin was cutting summer squash into a bushel basket. She saw him coming. She stood up. He stopped at the wire. He took his cap off. He held it against his chest. He said, Marin. She said, Boyd. How's your ground holding? It's holding. He said, mine ain't. She said, I know. He said, I've watched you 3 years now. Watched you break down that bad pile in '08. Watched you sell that first bag out of the diner. Watched you make that balloon. Watched Junie run in your yard in the spring. Watched everything you done. Marin and I have not said a thing about it because I did not have the right to say anything after what I did. But my ground is gone. I got 29 head left. I am going to lose 10 more by September if it don't rain. And you got green on your side of the wire and I ain't. She looked at him a long moment. He said hoarse, could you help me rebuild one of my fields, Marin? However long it takes. She looked past him at his pasture. She saw the cracked ground. She saw the sun on the cracked ground. She saw a cow standing in the far corner in what used to be shade and was now nothing. She said, Boyd. Yeah. Yes. He almost fell forward against the fence. His shoulders shook once and he made no sound. She said, it's going to take 3 years, Boyd. Maybe 4. You are going to have to let me fence off 10 acres of the north field and let it rest. You are going to have to put chips on it that I bring you, and I am going to bring you finished compost, and we are going to seed cover in the fall and rest it through the winter. You are going to have to buy hay this year and next year and probably the year after. It is going to cost you money you do not have. But if you can bear it, I will do the labor with you. Otis Halcombe from down the road works Fridays, and a young man named Tobias, who Dr. Kestrel sent me last spring, works Tuesdays. You are not going to be alone. He nodded. He could not speak. She said, go home, Boyd. Sit with Deanie. Tell her yes. Then come back in the morning. He nodded again. He turned and walked back to his house through his cracked pasture. She watched him go. That night she wrote in the notebook, Boyd asked. I said yes. 10 acres, 3-year rebuild. Under that, she wrote Grandpa. This is one you would have wanted to see. She underlined it. Two things happened in the second week of August of 2011 that closed the last of the story. The first was that a small article ran in the business section of the Charlotte Observer under the headline, State Pulls Funding on Marlow County Highway Spur Project. The article was 6 paragraphs long. It said that the Department of Transportation had, after a 2-year environmental review, decided that the proposed spur through eastern Marlow County was not economically viable due to insufficient groundwater reserves and unstable subsurface geology. It said that Terra Stark Development, which had assembled an option portfolio of approximately 600 acres along the corridor, in anticipation of the spur, had withdrawn from the county and was pursuing opportunities in an unnamed western state. It said that Devlin Rourke, listed on state filings as the firm's regional acquisition officer, was no longer with the firm. Odette Ruthven clipped the article out of the paper. She laminated it. She put it in a folder in her desk drawer. 2 weeks later, she brought it up to the ranch and handed it to Marin without saying anything. Marin read it in the yard. She put it in the drawer of the kitchen table on top of the folded paper from Devlin Rourke that she had never opened. The second thing was that Dr. Verity Kestrel called Marin on a Saturday morning and asked her to come up Kestrel Hollow Road for lunch. Marin drove up. Dr. Kestrel met her in the yard. She did not lead her to the greenhouse. She led her instead to the back porch of the small house set into the hillside. And on the porch was a low wooden table, and on the low wooden table was a cedar box. The box was about the size of a shoebox. The corners were dovetailed. The wood was pale where the lid met the base, and darker where the finger oils of decades had rubbed the outside. Dr. Kestrel said, "Sit down, Miss Ashby." Marin sat. Dr. Kestrel sat across from her. She said, "This box has been in my house for 32 years. It has letters in it. Some of them are from my sister Ione. Most of them are from your grandfather. He wrote to me every 3 or 4 months from the summer of 1979 until the winter of 1994, when Ione's illness had gotten bad, and he stopped because he was a man who did not know how to write to me without also writing to her. There are 41 letters. I have read every one of them a dozen times. There is a letter from July of 1983 that describes in detail the first working pile the three of us built on the low pasture of the Ashby place. Ione drew the diagram for that pile. She drew it in the kitchen of the house we shared in Chapel Hill. Your grandfather brought her diagram to the ranch and built the pile from it. It held 132 degrees at the core for 19 days. Then the men at the Marlow Co-op told your grandfather he was making a fool of himself, and he tore the pile down. Oh, she said, there is also a letter from October of 1991, written the year after your grandmother died, in which your grandfather told me that he had decided he had one job left in this life, which was to raise his granddaughter into a woman who would be brave enough to do what he had not been. She looked at Marin. She said, the box is yours, Miss Ashby. It has been yours since he wrote that letter in 1991. I have been keeping it for you until you were ready. You are ready now. Marin looked at the box. She looked at Dr. Kestrel. She said, Dr. Kestrel. Dr. Kestrel said, take it home. Read it there, not here. This is not a thing to be read in front of another person. Marin took the box. It was lighter than she had expected. She drove home slow. She parked the Ranger in the yard. She took the box inside. She set it on the kitchen table beside the small blue notebook and beside the green cardboard notebook her grandfather had left in the top drawer of the roll-top desk. She opened the lid. There were 41 envelopes inside. They were bundled with a length of soft twine. She untied the twine. She read the letters one by one in order over the following 7 hours. She read the letter of July of 1983. She read the letter of October of the same year that described the day Silas had torn the pile down and had come home and had sat at the kitchen table where Marin was sitting now and had put his head in his hands and had, according to his own words on that page, thought about giving up not just the pile, but the ground itself. She read the letter of 1991. She read the letter of 1994, in which he had told Dr. Kestrel that Ione's diagnosis had come in and that he was not going to burden Dr. Kestrel with his own letters anymore, and that if she ever needed anything at all, she was to write him at the old address. She read the last one twice. She set the letters down. She sat at the table for a long time in the failing afternoon light. She put the letters back in the box. She put the box on the shelf above the desk in the little back office above the photograph of Silas and Verity in 1983, which she had weeks earlier put back on the wall. She stood in the office a moment. Then she walked back to the kitchen. She stood at the window her grandfather had died at. She looked east at the ridge. The fog was beginning to come down. It was the second week of August of 2011. She was 26 years old. There was a paid note in a drawer downstairs. There was a bridge loan she had paid off 11 months ahead of schedule. There was a cedar box on a shelf. There was a ridge across the fence line where a man named Boyd Threlkeld was on a Saturday afternoon putting the first stakes into the ground to fence off the 10 acres they were going to rebuild together. She said out loud so that only the ridge could hear her, "I finished it, Grandpa." The wind moved the top of the pine above the mailbox. She stood there another minute, then she went outside. She walked down to the low pasture. She walked to what had once been Pile 2, the first pile that had ever finished into soil in April of 2009, and which now was not a pile at all, but a small level bed of dark black earth where a row of pole beans was climbing on a trellis. Boyd Threlkeld had helped her build in April of that year. She squatted down at the edge of it. She hooked 2 fingers into the ground. She lifted a small handful of the soil. It came up dark and loose. It came up with white root threads through it. It came up smelling like something that had been dead and had come back. She let it fall back onto the row. She stood up. She walked across this pasture, past the young apple trees she had planted with Otis Halcombe in the fall of '09, past the row of blueberries Merle Prine had brought her as bare root cuttings in the spring of 2010, past the small wooden signs she had made in the barn that read in her own careful print, "Mountain Soil Works." She walked to the fence at the low end of the pasture, and she leaned on it a moment, and she looked west across the property line. On the other side, Boyd Threlkeld was driving stakes into the ground with a maul. He saw her. He raised the maul in salute. She raised her hand. Behind him in the yard of his small white house, an 11-year-old girl was chasing a barn cat under a laundry line, and her name was Junie Threlkeld, and she had a scar under her sternum that would not fade, and she was running. Rowena Ashby wrote her daughter a letter in October of 2011. The letter was 2 pages long. It was written on the stationery of the office where Rowena worked in Charlotte. It did not apologize. It did not explain. It said only that Rowena had read a piece in the Asheville paper about a young farmer in Marlow County named Ashby who had developed a compost operation that had, in the drought of the summer, kept a portion of her neighbor's herd alive, and that Rowena had cut the article out and had put it on her refrigerator, and that she wanted her daughter to know she had done that. The letter ended with the line, "I do not know how to be your mother from this distance, but I know how to be proud of you." R. Marin read the letter twice. She wrote back that same afternoon. She wrote, "Mama, come see the ranch in the spring. Not to sell, not to argue, just to see." M. Rowena Ashby came in the 3rd week of April of 2012. She stayed 4 nights. She helped Marin spread finished compost on the vegetable beds. She wore an old canvas jacket of her father's that had been hanging in the mudroom since April of '07. She got dirt on her forearms up to the elbows. She did not, over the course of the 4 days, try once to talk her daughter into selling anything. On the last morning, standing at the kitchen window her father had died at, she said, "I did not know it looked like this now." Marin said, "It didn't. It does now." Rowena said, "It's beautiful, honey." Marin said, "I know it is." That was in the spring of '02. The last thing that happened in this story happened on a Sunday afternoon in the middle of July of 2013. Marin was 28 years old. Mountain Soil Works had grown slowly into a small standing business with 3 regular contract accounts and a farmer's market booth and a monthly workshop that Dr. Kestrel and Marin ran on the ranch together. The workshops were free. They were attended by farmers from as far away as Tennessee. Boyd Threlkeld's North 10 acres were by that summer back in native grass and holding water 3 inches down in dry weather, and Boyd Threlkeld had begun to be invited to co-op meetings again, where he had begun quietly to tell his neighbors what a hardwood pile could do to a piece of tired ground. On that Sunday afternoon, Marin sat at the kitchen table. She had 2 notebooks open in front of her. One was small and blue and softened at the corners from 7 years of pocket carry. The other was small and cardboard covered in green with a spine held together by a strip of black electrical tape, and its last dated entry was from the fall of 1994. And beside that last dated entry, in a hand that was not Silas Ashby's in fresh ink, Marin had written this morning one line, "Continued from here. M. Ashby, July 14, 2013. She closed both notebooks and set them side by side. She poured herself a cup of coffee. The July wind came up the valley through the open kitchen window, and it turned the top page of the green notebook back and then forward, and then still, and Marin Ashby sat at her grandfather's table with the cup in her hand and did not move for a long time. Outside in the low pasture that had once been called Woodchip Mountain by the children on the school bus, and which the children now called something else, small dark rows of finished compost rested between healthy vegetable beds and young orchard trees in the creek. At the far edge of the property, running clear and cold, moved south toward the broad river as it had for 400 years, without any pencil line drawn under it, by anyone in a city she was never going to have to think about again. She stood up. She rinsed the cup at the sink. She walked out onto the porch. The fog was not down yet. The sun was still on the eastern ridge. Boyd Threlkeld was in his side yard mending a section of fence with Junie sitting on a 5-gallon bucket handing him wire, and Harlan Beckett's newest driver was at that moment easing a truckload of separated cherry chips down the switchback with the trailer, swaying gentle behind him and up on Kestrel Hollow Road. A 78-year-old woman with a face like a hawk was in her greenhouse writing the introduction to a small book she had begun in June, and that she intended to dedicate when it was finished to a sister who had drawn the first diagram of a conical pile in 1979, and to a farmer who had built the first working one in 1983, and to a young woman who 28 years later had finished what the two of them had started. Marin stood on the porch a long moment. She thought about her grandfather at the window in the fog on a Wednesday in April. She thought about the mail carrier finding him standing there with the coffee gone cold. She thought about the 22-year-old girl who had driven west from Charlotte and had walked into a kitchen and had opened a drawer and had read a line about a pile that was not waste, but an unfinished forest. She thought that girl did not know what she was walking into, and she thought she does now. She walked down the porch steps. She walked across the yard. She walked toward the low pasture where a scatter of finished compost lay dark against the summer light, and where the piles that were still working stood in a low, quiet row along the western edge of the property, steam rising off the newest one in thin, gentle ropes against the late sky. Behind her in the drawer of the kitchen table, the folded paper from a man named Devlin Rourke lay unopened, still 6 years old, now faded at the crease, and it was never going to be opened, and Marin Ashby had not thought about it, or him, in a very long time.